22, and appreciate you joining us here for this Transcom meeting. Are there any members that are new members or alternates? Could you introduce yourselves if you're on the line with us now? Would you mind doing that now?
So glad to. I'm Joe Smoka. I'm a new member. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm a new member of the board under the COG. I represent as mayor Immigration Canyon Metro Township. I have a construction background. I'm a general contractor, and I look forward to helping on this committee.
Joe, welcome. Any others?
My name is Howard Madsen. I'm mayor in Sunset, and I'm an alternate to Mayor Shepherd, retired highway patrolman. Just happy to be here.
Wonderful. Andrew, you know Mayor Howard Madsen in your travels of the past, don't you?
Of course I do.
In another form, of course. He's done so well, Mayor Madsen. He's reformed now. He's no longer incarcerated. We're so proud of Andrew.
I'm glad he got out.
Any others?
So hi, Andrew. Mike Wickers, Mayor of Cottonwood Heights, and happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. Welcome.
Also, myself, Marcus Stevenson, the new Midvale City Mayor. Happy to be here, learn all I can from this group.
Wow, there's it, Marcus. That seat was held for a lot of years, wasn't it? By
Yeah, Mayor Sagini.
yeah,
Long time.
great person. Any others?
Yeah, this is Braden Mitchell, new mayor of Riverdale City.
Oh, I see you there, right there. What's the town I grew up in? Wonderful. Braden, it's good to see you, friend.
You too.
All right. Let's see. As I go over, I can't.
Mayor Hall from Bluffdale's here as well.
Great.
Yes, Mayor Hall from Bluffdale.
Super. I think the rest of them I kind of recognize. Terrific. We'll continue with the agenda. For those of you online, what we'd like to do now is take action on the minutes for the meeting held on November 18th to be approved. They came out in the packet. Do any of you have any questions or corrections on those minutes? Seeing or hearing none at this point, I'd entertain a motion for approval.
Mr. Chairman, this is Ann Granado. I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as sent to us.
Thank you, Ann, from Salt Lake County. Ann Granado, appreciate it. Who could I recognize as a second? Great. Mayor Madsen, thank you. Appreciate that. I'll ask basically are there any opposed? If you'd please unmute yourself and say, otherwise we're going to call that unanimous. Great. We're going to go to the chair's report now. I'm going to turn the time over to Miranda Jones-Cox, and she'll be able to touch on a few highlights from the current legislative session. Miranda, great to have you here. Thank you so much. I know it's been a whirlwind. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Appreciate it. Just wanted to provide a quick update of what's happening up on Capitol Hill right now, as I'm sure and know that many of you are very involved up there. At this time, we have just about 2 weeks left of the session, which is like woo, but also, you know, there's not a lot of time left to finish getting some things done. So we're working very hard and trying to get some things across the finish line. So kind of want to just update real quick on two things. So first, we'll talk about appropriations, and then second, about some pieces of legislation that are just worth being aware of. So right now in the appropriations process, the appropriations subcommittees in the legislature have already finished doing their work. They've already heard, you know, various requests for appropriation and have ranked how they would fund various funding proposals. Those lists, those ranked lists have gone to the Executive Appropriations Committee, or EAC. And now EAC, as they are finalizing the state's revenue estimates, are deciding exactly how the state's surplus revenue will be spent. We're anticipating that we'll probably see those numbers out relatively soon, and then we'll start seeing how the committee has prioritized funding items. Specifically, items that we have been promoting throughout the legislative session, and requesting of the legislature to support, kind of falls under two buckets. One is multimodal transportation investments. So multimodal being roadway, transit, and active transportation. Specifically with transit, the legislature has already funded $232 million to replace previously authorized bonds on Frontrunner. So last year that funding was authorized, and now the legislature has replaced that bond authorization with cash, allowing the state to save money in interest investment, or in interest, but also allowing the state to use the Transit Transportation Investment Fund, or the TTIF, for other transit projects throughout the state. So that one is kind of it's a big win, and we're really happy that the legislature has already funded and prioritized that. Second, with multimodal transportation investments, is more funding for roadways. Earlier, I think maybe this was last month, Representative Schultz mentioned to our WFRC council meeting that the state would likely see more funding put towards multimodal transportation, and we're likely to see some more funding going towards accelerating roadway projects as prioritized in the unified plan, and the work that we do here. So we're still waiting to see exactly how that will materialize, and to what dollar or figure amount, if that's the case, but we're anticipating that. And then third is active transportation investments. So last year, the legislature funded $35 million for regionally important active transportation projects. And the governor's budget recommended an additional $46 million this year. We have been very supportive of that request, along with our partners at UDOT, and pushing for that active transportation money. Again, it's still a little too soon to tell how successful that request will be, but we, and many of you may have seen this, and if you haven't, I don't know if we have Hugh on, and if not, Andrew, maybe I'll have you drop. There we go. In the chat is our active transportation sign-on letter, asking legislators and the governor's office to support additional funding for active transportation projects. So if you haven't had the chance, please feel free to sign on that, as we will be delivering that to legislators, I believe, tomorrow. So that's kind of where we're at with multimodal transportation investments. We're also pursuing money for planning and technical assistance. So
Hey, Miranda.
yeah,
Can I just interject, and just
Sure.
before we move off of the deliberations happening on infrastructure investment, maybe we could just take a pause and see if anybody wants to ask any questions or comment on that topic before moving on. And maybe as you're thinking, if you have any comments you want to add, I'll just add that, and to build upon what Miranda said, the fact that there's significant revenues available that are one-time now means that there's a real possibility of a significant amount of investment being made in infrastructure, which is a really good investment to make for one-time funds, because they have an ongoing benefit from a one-time expenditure. And just particularly for our new members of this committee, I'd note that one of the roles that this committee has is in evaluating and doing work in identifying the priorities for particular transportation projects. Now, that work is done in such close coordination with our partners at UDOT and at UTA. And there is a great deal of value and respect given by the legislature and the governor's office for the work that's done by the transportation agencies. And part of the reason they value it is because they know that you're involved in that the local governments are involved in putting together the Unified Transportation Plan, which looks at priorities over decades, and then the Transportation Improvement Program, which looks at actual dollars going to projects over the next few years. And those projects are drawn out of the first phase of the Unified Transportation Plan. So I just wanted to make sure that you all were keying into the fact that when the legislature then provides funds like Miranda is talking about, what we suggest is that that process that we all use together, that the Transportation Commission coordinates with help from the great staff at UDOT, and Terry's with us here today, that when projects are funded, our recommendation is that they be drawn from that prioritization process. And that's what happened last year. And we anticipate that that's what would happen this year to the extent there's additional funding put to transportation. I say all that just for a little bit of context, and also just to reinforce to everybody here the value of you as local elected officials with your communities participating in the work that we do through WFRC with our partners to really identify what the most important needs are and go through this process, which involves your input and data and analysis to figure out what the best uses of limited resources are for transportation infrastructure investment. So Miranda, I don't know, and Mr. Chair, I don't know if anybody has any comments or questions that they want to add to that, but just thanks for allowing me to provide a little bit more context on the tie between what Miranda's talking about and the work that we do here.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that very much. Miranda?
Yeah, I'll just finish up on appropriation side of things. So in addition to the, like I said, in addition to the transportation funding, we're also pursuing funding for technical assistance and planning money. So specifically two appropriations, both have been requested by the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. One is $1.65 million, 600 million of which or 600,000 of which would go to the Utah Department of Transportation for their technical assistance planning program. And then the remainder, roughly $1 million, would go to the state's 7 associations of governments for technical assistance. So when you think technical assistance, kind of think like our transportation land use connection program that have helped, many of your communities with, different projects over the last few years, and, having more capacity to be able to help our local communities. And so that was ranked not as well as we wanted it to be, or some of the funding was cut in preliminary rankings. And so WFRC Chairman Silvestrini and Mayor Don Ramsey of South Jordan wrote a letter on behalf of the Utah League of Cities and Towns and Wasatch Front Regional Council to the Executive Appropriations Committee, and sent that just yesterday, asking them to reprioritize those funds, as they are extremely important to the work that we do here with our local communities. But it's also worth noting that appropriation was endorsed by the state's Unified Economic Opportunity Commission and was worked on throughout the interim. And so in addition to that is a $1 million appropriation request for a statewide growth conversation. So again, this other one was also endorsed by the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission, and in essence would allow Utah would allow WFRC, the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, a lot of our other various partners throughout the state, to have a statewide growth planning conversation to help understand where locals or where local residents are coming from with their concerns for growth, but also to help educate on the importance of planning principles in planning for growth and accommodating the growth that we'll continue to see over the coming years. And so again, these two appropriations we hope will be successful, but we're still waiting to see exactly where they'll end up with the prioritizations by the Executive Appropriations Committee. So with that, again, if anyone, does anyone have any questions about appropriations before I just touch on a few bills that might be worth knowing about?
Questions for Ms. Cox? Keep going there, Miranda.
Okay. So briefly, I'll just run through a few bills, and some of them are still yet to be released, which is crazy because we just have 2 weeks left. But first of all, worth noting is that we have our WFRC bill tracker, which you guys can all keep an eye on and take a look and see what bills we've been watching and looking at. Our, recommendation on whether WFRC supports, is neutral or opposed to certain bills, brief summaries. And so feel free to browse that and ask any questions. Reach out to me if you have any questions on that. So I don't know if Andrew, you want to drop a link to that in the chat as well. But specifically, a few bills worth mentioning is one is SB 140, or Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone Amendment. So many of you are likely aware of the HTRZ bill, which passed last year, SB 217. WFRC has been, integral in putting that bill together with Senator Wayne Harper and Representative Christopherson, and have continued to work with him along with other partners throughout the state, especially Salt Lake County, to make some changes to that bill. So SB 217, or the HTRZ bill, essentially allows for tax increment capture around 1/3 of a mile of front runner stations to as a development tool to provide additional affordable housing. This bill would allow that to expand now, a limited expansion to tracks and BRT stations with a cap of the total number of HTRZ allowed in a given county. And so there's a lot kind of going on in that bill, and we've shared a lot of information in the past about HTRZs, and so happy to share more information there. We'll also drop in the chat the SB 140 summary, which links to this bill, and then SB 217 from last year. There are also a few others to note, and some of these are still to come, is the big housing affordability bill from Representative Waldrop. This will make some changes to SB 34, or the Moderate Income Housing Plan bill, which passed, I think, in 2019, requiring locals or municipalities to do moderate income housing plan planning. And so they'll be making a few changes to that. Our friends at the League have been working really closely in conjunction with Representative Waldrop on that, and have been sharing a lot of information about changes to that bill.
Miranda, quick question.
Yeah.
Is that the SB 34 plus? Is that getting a new number this year?
Has that what?
Has that been numbered? Or
No, so that one is still, it has yet to be released. I assume we'll see that coming out in the next, I don't know, day or two, or maybe even early next week, we'll likely see that one numbered. But yes, SB 34 plus is kind of what this has been coined as. So
thanks.
Yeah. Another one that you'll likely see coming out from Representative Waldrop is a station area planning bill, or a transit-oriented development bill. So this bill, again, still yet to be released, and we don't have language on that yet, would require municipalities with a front runner or track station or BRT station to develop station area plans around those areas. Andrew, if you want to weigh in on anything here, feel free. Again, something that we've been working with our partners on, and LPC, this has been shared quite a bit at LPC, and we've tried to share some brief information on this. But ultimately, the bill would allow communities to decide how to plan around their transit. They get to decide how to best utilize their transit area and how to develop around those areas. And so, Andrew, do you have anything to add to this one?
Well, I'll add a little, and Beth Holbrook from UTA has been working on this and can feel free to comment as well. Let me just be candid and sort of at the risk of sounding a little political on this. First, the big issue that we're all confronting, you and your communities are confronting, of course, is housing availability and housing affordability, the skyrocketing housing prices, which ties, of course, in part to the fact that our state was the fastest growing state in the nation over the last 10 years. And so there's a real interest shared among all of us and the legislature to try to tackle these issues in ways that are productive. And part of that gets at more housing production, even though last year was a record-setting year for local permitting of housing projects, which broke a record that had been set just the previous year. But nonetheless, there's still a significant shortage. And we know that the areas around transit stations, high capacity transit stations, are really good areas to absorb more growth and development in housing and jobs with a mix of housing types, the coordination of housing and transportation. You know this from your own communities. You know it because it's at the core of our shared Wasatch Choice regional vision, which contemplates the areas that you identified in your communities as being good areas to absorb more growth, being a focal points for centers and more development. Well, the idea here is that, again, as Miranda said, those of you that have transit stations in your communities, you'd have to do a station area plan around them. This differs from what's happening in some other states, California, Oregon, some other states where the legislature is mandating certain types of zoning, requiring, for example, minimum levels of density, or doing doing spot zoning, directing the type of development that should occur. The approach that this reflects is a more collaborative approach, where we recognize that areas where there's been significant public infrastructure investment through the transit system are good areas to locate more housing, but that you should have the ability to decide what really makes sense. And one community is different than another, right? What makes sense around the Roy front-runner station is going to be different than just down the front-runner line at the Clearfield front-runner station. The conditions are different, and let alone a TRAX or a BRT line. So it provides a significant degree of flexibility for you to be more responsive to the conditions on the ground. I don't know. Maybe I'll just leave it there and see if Beth wants to add anything to that.
Andrew, thank you so much. I think that you nailed it as always. And for those of you who don't know, I know some of you are new to hear some of the introductions earlier. Andrew is such a great resource and really has worked really hard to make sure that we are all working together collaboratively and strategically. And so thank you for that. I just wanted to wear a different hat for just a moment. I also sit on the Commission for Housing Affordability, where this bill was kind of focused on. And one of the elements that we thought was a really good strategy is to incorporate something that will be done anyway once there is a station area. If there's a station area identified within a community, and there could be one, there could be multiples, depending upon the community, there will be a station area plan needed for that location. And so this is a way for us to work to address housing needs, including affordable housing potentially as well. And we know that that is a kind of a fluid term sometimes, as well as putting it strategically, because we do know that there is also this pressure of, we want to be able to collaborate and manage growth as best as we can. And so we feel like this is a good opportunity to work together, to have that local control, to have that collaborative input from the NPOs as well as UTA, to really help all of our communities to design density in a way that's going to make the most sense. So with that, I'll entertain any other questions. And yes, I'll put my UTA hat back on. And UTA is also very supportive and has worked really hard on our side as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Beth. I appreciate that. The only other last bill I wanted just to note and to recognize is HB 322. So this bill I'm trying to remember what the title is off the top of my head. I think it's
Public Transit
Capital.
Capital Development Amendments.
Thanks, Andrew. So handy. So what this bill would do is it would require coordination between UDOT and UTA on transit capital development projects, but specifically projects that the state has invested money in. So the bill calls out specifically the double tracking of Front Runner, as well as the Point of the Mountain transit area. Not that nothing has been done there yet, but is anticipated in the future. And so this bill basically requires UDOT to now take a more a greater role in working with the Utah Transit Authority to coordinate on those projects and on project delivery together. And Beth, I don't know if you're still on as well, and Terry, maybe you want to just I don't know if you either want to say something just briefly about this, but one thing that we know here at WFRC and that we've heard from both of our partners at UDOT and UTA are that they're willing and invest in making sure that those projects are delivered in a very efficient way, and that the two organizations just plan to work together over the course of those capital projects. And so Terry, Beth, I don't know if you want to add anything briefly.
Go ahead, Terry, Beth, either one.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Commissioner. I'm happy to add some, and thank you, Miranda, as well. As we look at some of these projects moving forward, we recognize that state investment in public transit is going to be one of the key things that helps us to manage our growth. We recognize that not everyone's going to take transit, but if we can get more integral infrastructure throughout our region, then the better we will be. And if we can do that as we are growing instead of after the fact, then it's going to be even better. And so when the state wants to commit more money to doing public transit, and as you can see, there's a lot of support for this bill, we feel like that this is a good strategy. We, Miranda already said it, we work really well with UDOT already, and we want to continue to develop these areas. Let me just give you a quick example. When you look at Point of the Mountain right now, there's no ridership data because there's no ridership, right? And so when you look at a federal funding piece, the federal funding is not as high on a project like this potentially as it would be on another project where you can provide data. And so by allowing the UDOT to kind of coordinate the Point of the Mountain, for instance, this allows a larger portion of state development funding to go into that. And that strategy will, again, help us to manage our growth in a more effective way, because we're doing this simultaneous to working other areas as well. And so we do support this bill. And again, and if there's any questions, please feel free. I know that Terry is also a great advocate of this and has worked really hard to make sure that this is going to be as successful as possible.
Ms. Newell, care to comment?
I'd just say I won't go so far as to say great advocate, because we didn't advocate for it, but we are certainly willing to work with UTA. As many of you probably realize, it's hard to make the transition. And I would say that UTA has been absolutely great to work with. Everyone has been very opening the doors and letting us listen to conversations and try to help figure out how we're going to make this transition. So just ask all of you guys to help support us as we make a transition. Couple things that I just want to make sure that we're thinking about all the time is that in making this change, nobody wants the projects to slow down or take additional funding and try to start redoing anything. And so we're trying to keep that in mind as we shift some of the decision making to UDOT, trying to figure out how we do that, efficiently and effectively. So that's kind of how we're approaching this. But can't say enough about how good UTA has been in the whole 2 weeks that we've been dealing with this. And as we continue forward, I know we'll make it successful because we need to.
Thank you, Terry. Miranda, is there anything else you'd like to, as you conclude here, to wrap up?
Yeah, no, those were the last bills to mention. So that kind of concludes the state legislative update. But just just to echo what Terry and Beth said, if there's anything we do well here in Utah, especially with our transportation partners, is work well together. And so we're looking forward to the last few weeks of session to ultimately see, the funding that the legislature decides to put towards transportation investments. And we'll be sure to continue to keep you all apprised with information about all that. But if there's any questions we can ever answer, please feel free to reach out. So.
Thank you. In the 5 years being associated with this group, Miranda, you've really just blossomed. I appreciate how you've really grown into this, and you're very efficient at what you're doing. Thank you. For those new members here, if you're a little new to this format, if you'll use your mouse to highlight anything on the screen and go down to the chat, it's a little square chat type button. If you'll click that button in the chat, you'll see that Andrew Gruber has put some of the documents and links for a lot of the things that bill trackers, a lot of the things that Miranda's talked about, and that's good. In just a moment, what I'd like to do before I turn the time back over to Mayor Mark Shepard of Clearfield, I'd like to pause and ask Andrea if you'd do a roll call, please, and then Mayor Shepard will turn the time over to you to pick up with item number 3. Thank you. Go ahead, Andrea.
Thanks, Commissioner. In attendance today, we have Jim Harvey, Andrea Pearson, Howard Madsen, Robert Dandoy, Marcus Stevenson, Joel Smolka, Wayne Benyon, Terry Newell, Andrew Gruber, Mike Wykers, Dennis Pay, Miranda Jones-Cox, Jennifer Elskin, Beth Holbrook, Mark Shepard, Natalie Hall, Hugh Van Wagenen, Ben Rothridge, Rob Dolly, Ted Knowlton, Bert Gramberg, Rosie Hernandez, Russ Fox, Mike Sobchak, Ned Hacker, Colby Oliverson, Ann Granado, Shul Bishop, Blake Thomas, Kevin Van Tassel, Steve Van Maren, Bryce Bird, Christy Dahlberg, Ivan Marrero, Kyler Brower, Braden Mitchell, Brad Palmer, and someone joining us via phone. Thank you.
Well, all right. I got to tell you, it's nice to be back in the WFRC offices. It was just, I wish everybody could be here in the WFRC offices. It's kind of nice to be here, but thank you, Andrea. Do we have anybody else that was there that we missed by any chance? Okay.
The person on the phone tried to state their name.
I didn't even know you were here, Mayor. I might wander down the hall and say hello.
I just missed you. That was why I came. Who is on the phone?
It's Kevin Cromar on the phone.
Oh, thanks, Kevin. Well, we're going to move item. Commissioner, thank you for jumping in there and getting us rolling while I was parking underneath the building and lost signal. So we're going to move item number 6 up and turn some time over to Wayne to talk about federal infrastructure law update and competing funding opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll let this will help, I think, with flow, but we'll let Miranda do a little context before I share information on the competitive grant programs, just for context on the federal scene. So
perfect.
Miranda, if you want to briefly review a couple things, that'd be great.
Okay, sure will. Can everyone see my screen okay? Let's see. There we go. So I'm not going to go through this whole slideshow, but just kind of wanted to give some context again and some reminders. Also, sorry, this is turning into the Miranda spiel before we let anyone else talk. So sorry about that. But talking about the federal infrastructure bill, this passed last year and was signed into law. So when we're talking about the federal infrastructure bill, we're also talking about the federal infrastructure law, which also has been known by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So there's a lot of names that you'll hear about this bill, but kind of want to chunk it down into some high level things. So first, the bill was $1.2 trillion. The bill had $550 billion in new funding. So meaning that, roughly $700 billion of that was existing funding or baseline funding, which just continues on or is, reauthorized each year. This bill includes the transportation reauthorization, which is usually reauthorized every 5 years. So the funding, which is provided in this bill, though it's, $550 billion of new dollars, it's over a 5-year period. It's important to note that the infrastructure bill is not COVID relief funding. It's not ARPA funding, and it's not treated as such. Most of the funding or the funding is kind of split into 2 different categories. One is formula funds, and the other are discretionary grant programs. So the formula funds come directly to states and to local entities, and are for various programs that we already have in place and that we already do. So UDOT gets federal funding through this bill through formula funds to operate and maintain Utah's roads. WFRC, we get funding through formula for our STP program, or surface transportation planning. We get planning funding. We get congestion mitigation, air quality funding. So that funding will come directly to us, and we'll see some increases in those funding to offset inflation and just some bumps in that funding. But then there's this other pot or discretionary grant programs, and this bill, the federal infrastructure bill, has many new discretionary grant programs. You mainly have heard of the big ones, right? Like RAISE and some of the others, but there are going to be a lot of new discretionary grant programs, and Wayne is going to touch on some of that a little bit. Ultimately, the funding in the bill, though it's mainly for transportation, it also includes other funding for roads, bridges, rail, transit, water, broadband, etc. So just want to touch again briefly of what we have coming to Utah, which is the roughly $4 billion total in the bill coming to the state. But specifically in transportation, there's roughly $3.3 billion coming to the state. I'm gonna stop sharing now. So in the process of trying to understand what the infrastructure bill means, how we can take advantage of it, how it impacts us in our communities, WFRC has been engaging in some different efforts to help with that. One is right now we're working with our partners, the National Association of Regional Councils, who represent regional councils across the country, to further understand and provide feedback to the U.S. Department of Transportation about the various provisions within the infrastructure bill. So here at WFRC, we're leading a group that's analyzing the planning provisions of the bill. So looking at the various policy changes that are being changed or added to our plates, and what that means for regional councils like WFRC, and how it changes the work that we do, or new requirements that will be held to. And so that information we'll take back to NARC, or NARC, National Association of Regional Councils, and they will take that to the U.S. Department of Transportation to help kind of provide feedback as USDOT writes rules and regulations on these various programs. And then second, kind of the last thing to touch on, or one of the last things to touch on before I hand it back to Wayne, is the bill, while it has been passed, we're still waiting on kind of like some final funding to materialize. So as many of you have maybe seen in the news, Congress has yet to reach a funding deal for the federal fiscal year and to pass a congressional budget. They keep working off of a series of continuing resolutions. And the problem with working off of continuing resolutions is that the funding increases that are for formula funds in the infrastructure bill aren't realized for this fiscal year until they actually pass the budget. And so we're, hoping that we'll see a budget finally passed. There was news, I believe, last week saying that they maybe struck a deal. And so we're hoping to see that materialize in the coming weeks so that us and our transportation partners here in the state can take full advantage of the increases in the federal infrastructure bill. This was one of the points that WFRC leadership and Andrew and myself actually brought back to our federal delegation when we were at a NARC conference last week in Washington, D.C. We met with all 6 members of the Utah congressional delegation to share with them the importance of the infrastructure bill, thank them for, thank Senator Romney for his part that he played in getting that passed. And then also, asking them them and their colleagues to pass a full fiscal year budget so that that we can start fully implementing the increases that we see in the infrastructure bill. They were really great meetings. And I think the biggest takeaway from those is that our congressional members are just as eager and interested in helping us and our communities take advantage of the opportunities in the infrastructure bill, specifically with the discretionary grant programs that are available that our communities can apply for, that we can join together and apply for joint projects. And they just want to be as helpful as they can in making sure that we're successful in those applications. And so with that, Wayne, I don't know if you want to, and Andrew.
Miranda, I just want to make one quick point, and that is Jennifer Elskin is with us from the Federal Highway Administration. Jennifer is our Utah rep that works with WFRC and our partners through FHWA. And she's already been great about sharing information with us about what's coming out of the federal infrastructure law. And Jennifer, you can comment if you'd like to, you don't have to, but I just want to note that I know that we're going to work together with our partners through USDOT, FHWA, Jennifer, FTA, the Transit Administration, on making sure that Utah's interests are well represented and that we have smooth sailing in implementing and putting the bill and its provisions and funds to use here in Utah. Right, Jennifer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and anything new coming out, I'll get that to you as soon as I can. And we're still waiting. As Miranda said, we don't have a budget yet. We're still waiting for the new guidance. We're waiting for all that new information. But so yeah, we'll get that out to you as soon as we can.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you. And so I am by no means an expert, but we did want to share briefly some information about a handful of maybe some of the more impactful transportation programs that are available for competing for. So you can be watching for those. And so others, feel free to interrupt with questions and if anybody else on the line has more accurate information than I do, feel free to interject. But these are the competitive funding programs or discretionary grant programs that I'll be talking about. And for each one of these, I'll share a bit of information on the screen about amount of funding available, types of eligible projects, criteria for selecting those, timelines for applying if those are available yet, or when to expect them, and if available, a bit about grant size and local match. So each year over the next 5 years or over the life of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's 1.5 billion available nationally. And
Mr. Scarborough, this is Brad Palmer. Hey, it's been a while since we.
And so you can see some of the projects that are eligible here and some of the selection criteria. This is the program that is farthest along, and applications this cycle this year are due April 14th. More information at the end of my comments on how to apply, but that's a bit about the RAISE grant program. And a little bit more, you can see some minimum federal grant sizes. There is a 20% local match required on most of these projects. And then this next one, due to the size, the minimum size of the grants, as you can see here, it's called the MEGA program, and selection criteria are supposed to be posted sometime this month. Next one is infra. This is like RAISE, is a continuation of prior discretionary grant programs. But this is primarily for highway and rail projects of regional significance. There's a $5 million minimum, and it's only up to a 60% federal share. You can use other federal funding sources to get you up to an 80%. But for the funding that comes directly from this program, it's 60% of the total project cost that would come from this program. And it's anticipated that a notice of funding opportunity for infra grants will be released in March of this year. This program, Safe Streets and Roads for All, is exclusively for local governments. And the focus is to make improvements and or plan for improvements that reduce fatalities and serious injuries, especially among cyclists and pedestrians. And it's likely that how effective the project is expected to be in accomplishing that goal will be part of the selection criteria. And applications for this grant are scheduled to open sometime in May of this year. Also, as I alluded to, there is an option to apply for planning, or in other words, planning, design, and development activities that are identified in a comprehensive safety action plan are eligible and can compete for 40% of the total funding this program. Charging and fueling infrastructure grants. There's a focus here. At least half of the funds need to go to community grant programs where priority is given to rural areas and low and moderate income neighborhoods. And then finally, there's a rural surface transportation grant program that's a competitive program. And this is intended to increase connectivity, improve safety and reliability, and facilitate economic growth. Those are the increasing connectivity and in making those types of improvements with an economic impact will help the applicant be more likely to receive funding through this program. And currently, applications are scheduled to be accepted or open rather for opportunity to apply in March. And in this, there's 40 million a year set aside for projects that are less than 25 million. So a few key points about applying. WFRC is happy to help provide information. We're not equipped to help write the application, but we're happy to point you in the right direction and get you in touch even directly at times with people who can help guide you through the application process. As you might imagine, as you can see from this second bullet here, the application process can be fairly involved, but perhaps that should be expected with the size of funding that's available through some of these programs. And there's an opportunity, there should be an opportunity to apply each of the next 5 years. And then this last bullet refers to the fact that, like Miranda was mentioning, there are numerous other programs, some with a climate and energy focus, some with a broadband focus, but there are numerous other discretionary grant programs that local governments and public agencies can apply for. Most of these are only available for public agencies. They're not available for nonprofit organizations unless they partner with a public agency. So, and these slides will be available on the WFRC website under the committees heading. If you go down to Transcom and then go to this meeting, and under presentations, these will be available on the website by next week. Any questions? If not, that was a flood of information, but hopefully you'll keep in mind that you can encourage your staff to look into some of these. And like I said, WFRC is happy to assist them in applying for these programs. Thank you.
To that, Wayne, to that point, I imagine some of the mayors and county officials on here were thinking just that about, well, does my staff have this information? And it would be helpful. And I think Wayne, Ben, Miranda, have you shared comparable information with through our technical advisory committees that are made up of the staffs of the local governments here?
Next week, this information, this same presentation will be shared with your city engineers and public works directors. So,
okay, great.
So there is money out there, go get it.
Exactly. And actually, that's an excellent point, Mr. Chair, because Utah historically, over the last several years, has been quite successful in competing for some of these programs. So thank you.
Definitely. Well, I'm going to go back up to number 3 just to get us back on track there. I don't know if we have anybody here that was here to give public comment, but this is our opportunity, or your opportunity. Andrew, did we have anybody noted that was here to speak?
No one that was noted, no.
Okay. Well, then, seeing no public comment, we'll go ahead and move on. And I'm going to turn the time back over to Wayne. We're going to talk about Transcom's roles and responsibilities, especially for those of you who are new, and a refresher for everybody else, and talk about our schedule for this year.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, at the first meeting of the year, several of you know we like to briefly review Transcom's roles and responsibilities. Please, again, feel free to interject or interrupt me with questions, and we will hope that the information is useful to you. So, if I can get my machine to cooperate here. Just by way of context, the Regional Council, as you know, is the metropolitan planning organization for the Ogden, Layton, and West Valley, Salt Lake City, West Valley urbanized areas. In addition to that, the Regional Council functions as the association of governments for those two urbanized areas and also Morgan and Tooele counties. And as the MPO is responsible for working closely with UDOT and UTA and the local governments for developing long and short range transportation plans and programs. And you can see that Transcom fits into this picture as a policy advisory committee, to the Regional Council, along with the Regional Growth Committee. The Regional Growth Committee focuses on long-range planning and growth, long-term growth issues. Transcom focuses on short-range issues, including the programming of funds. In your meeting materials, you have available the most recent version of a memorandum of agreement among WFRC, UDOT, and UTA that establishes the roles and purpose, the membership of both Transcom and the Regional Growth Committee. And the intent is to have a continuous and comprehensive and cooperative planning process. And before we talk about Transcom, so that's the role of Transcom. Before we talk about Transcom, some of the specific responsibilities of Transcom, it's helpful to understand that one of the two primary products that the Regional Council is responsible for, along with the Regional Transportation Plan, is the Transportation Improvement Program, which is a 6-year program, multimodal program, including local, state, and federal funding sources committed to projects. And it gets updated annually. Transcom's responsibilities include releasing the TIP, or the Transportation Improvement Program, for public comment, recommending the TIP for approval, recommending to the Regional Council the TIP for approval. And at most Transcom meetings, the Regional Council, or in other words, the Regional Council has delegated responsibility to Transcom for approving amendments or modifications to projects and programs within the TIP at their meetings. And also, the Regional Council is specifically responsible for programming 3 federal sources of funding that you can see on the screen here. And Transcom has the opportunity to recommend, based on input from both staff and the Transcom technical advisory committees, one for each urbanized area, make recommendations on projects adding up to about $40 or $45 million each year. And these projects are mostly local governments have the opportunity to apply to WFRC for these projects, and then Transcom is key in recommending or deciding which projects to recommend to the Regional Council for funding each year. Although the projects are scheduled out a few years, 5 or 6 years into the future. So you can also, in the meeting materials, there's an outline, proposed tentative agendas for each of the meetings, a few highlights from that schedule that correspond to the responsibilities that I mentioned earlier. June for the release to public comment, August for recommending approval of the Transportation Improvement Program. And as I mentioned about the opportunity to apply for funding through WFRC, letters of intent followed by applications are requested each fall. And then in the spring, there's the recommendation process for those funding programs. And I would especially invite you to, in addition to asking any questions you have, I would invite you to suggest additional topics for our meetings this year. Would love to hear what's on your mind and learn what you would like to see discussed in the way of short-range, near-term transportation plans. And here are some potential additional discussion topics, maybe to stimulate your thoughts on other topics you might have.
Well,
Back
thank
to
you,
you.
Wayne. I appreciate that, Wayne. Look at those topics, folks. I mean, there's things we want to make the meeting worthwhile. And so if there's things that you would like either updates on or instruction on or topics you want to discuss, if you'd let Wayne or I know, that would be wonderful. Wayne talked a bit about the tip. We at our last board meeting, we had some modifications. Those are in your packet. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer those at this point. And if not, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Ben to talk about our board modifications to the 2022-2027 tip. Ben, it's all yours.
Can people hear Ben?
No.
Ben, we're not hearing you.
How about now?
Now we can hear you.
Wow, great. I already presented it all. I hope it was enjoyable. But we'll go over it again real quick here. So in a timely manner and an opportunity, I'd like to review with this committee a little on the Transportation Improvement Program. That was, as Wayne covered it in a very quick summary manner. We are currently working under the 2022-2027 Transportation Improvement Program. And as Wayne pointed out, it is a 6-year program of highway transit and active transportation projects, has 4 funded years, and then 2 out years that we refer to as concept development years. So it's a 6-year program. It's the urbanized area in the Salt Lake West Valley and the Ogden-Layton urban area. So essentially from Brigham City down to the Utah County is our area where the TIP has projects that are funded with federal, state, and local programs. And it's for all of the cities and the counties, UDOT and UTA. And so the Transportation Improvement Program, it implements the long-range plans, the highway transit and active transportation projects. It helps us meet the short-range needs along the Wasatch Front, and it provides for the maintenance of our existing transportation system. And as Wayne mentioned, because of the dynamics, periodic modifications are pretty much every meeting. We have an opportunity to take a board modification or some form of action. And when WFRC is at meeting, they've delegated that to Transcom. So your responsibilities are critical to the Transportation Improvement Program. And we value your input. Your interaction, your questions, your recommendations and comments are critical to the development of the Transportation Improvement Program. And then, of course, we update it annually and we'll have meetings to come where we'll get to talk about a lot of exciting things to come. But today, there are 3 items that pertain to the Transportation Improvement Program. There's a report on the approved board modification that took place with the council in January. There's an approval for a new board modification that we'd like to present to you today on the 2022-2027 TIP. And then as a responsibility, we have to review the federal funds that have been obligated this past fiscal year, the fiscal year of 2021. So as Chair Shepherd indicated, and the regional council, they met last month. They had a board modification before them, a copy of that signed resolution, along with both tables that identify those projects, is included in your meeting materials, and that's then there for your information so that you're aware of what's happening in the transportation improvement program. And Mr. Chair, is it all right? I just keep going through?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. So WFRC has received a request to again modify the 2022-2027 TIP. This will be the fourth board modification since the regional council approved this last August. A copy of the resolution modifying the TIP is included in your meeting materials, as well as a list of the modifications. And I'll briefly review each of the new projects in the amendment to the TIP. But it's important to note that the projects that are included in this proposed amendment or this board modification, as we'll refer it to, they're either included in phase 1 of the regional transportation plan, or they are not regionally significant, or they are exempt projects that do not need to be reviewed for conformity and consistency with the state implementation plan. This is important to note because following these 3 criteria, this means we do not, or it is not required that we go out for a 30-day public comment period. But the review and comment period takes place in this meeting. So starting in, we have 3 tables. This first table identifies 3 projects. The first project that we'll look at is a project in Salt Lake County. It's a local government project on Redwood Road. This is a Taylorsville sponsored project. This is access management, including drainage and safety on Redwood Road between 4100 South and 5400 South. The project is to improve operations and safety along the corridor. Some of the strategies include adding additional turn pockets and constructing bus pullouts, removing utility poles by burying the overhead power lines, improving street lighting along Redwood Road, and improving access management. I'd like to show you just one small segment. This is looking south on Redwood Road and looking into all the access that comes onto Redwood Road. And so this project will help improve the safety along this corridor. Recently, bids were opened with the low bid coming in about 22% over the engineer's estimate. And the main items that come in high on this project include several concrete items and in construction cost of burying the power lines. But the thing that's kudos to the city. So Taylorville City is committed to come forward with the remaining $1.5 million so that this project can be awarded and it can start construction this spring. The next project that we'll look at is a project that's also in Salt Lake City. This is another local government project. This is a project along 5th West. This is South Salt Lake project between 33rd South and 39th South. The scope of this local government project is to reconstruct the existing roadway, upgrade the drainage system, install bike lanes, and rebuild the signal at 3300 South. This project was initially approved and funded back in 2015. However, the current estimates show this project to be underfunded. And this is another one where accolades to the city of South Salt Lake. They are requesting that we add $2.5 million to this project, giving us a total project cost of $8.2 million. But the city is committed to bringing these additional funds to this project. So well done, South Salt Lake. The next project that we have to look at is also a project in Salt Lake. This is a UDOT project. This is a project on State Street. This will reconstruct with some minor widening between I-215 to 30th South. The scope of this project is to perform a pavement preservation of a 1-inch rotomill with a 1-inch open grade course or surface, open grade course surface, OGSC. And then they'll replace substandard ADA pedestrian ramps replace a raised median at the intersection of Vine Street to extend the left turn pockets. Recently, the bids were opened on this project with the low bid coming in 18% over the engineer's estimate. The main items that came in high included the mobilization, traffic control, materials costs due to the inflation for the OGSC. And then Region 2 would like to award this project so construction can begin this spring. So they're requesting that we include an additional $1.1 million in this project, giving us a total project cost of 8.2 plus million. These additional funds come from the Region 2's Transportation Solutions Program. Well, that brings us to the second table that identifies 3 more projects of this board modification. The first project on this list begins also in Salt Lake City. This is a UDOT project on Redwood Road. This is for additional lanes, freeway ramps, intersection improvements. This improvement takes place between 6200 South and I-215. The scope of this project is to add an additional northbound lane on Redwood Road from 6200 South to I-215, add dual lanes to the eastbound and westbound on-ramps, and then construct a northbound displays left turn continuous flow intersection. Maybe to remind you, on a continuous flow intersection, you can see the blue line, how it's allowed to cross traffic and then wait at the intersection until it's appropriate for it to turn. But during the design phase of the project, it was discovered that the drainage system in this area needed to be upgraded to accommodate the widening of the roadway and to relieve the demand on the existing city system. And so additional funds are needed to address the increased cost of the right-of-way and the utilities and the material costs due to inflation. These additional funds would also be paid from the Region 2 Transportation Solution Program, or the R2 TSP, we call them. Anyway, additional funding, 4.4 plus million. Total project estimated cost is a little more than $14 million. The next project in this board modification is a project up in Morgan. This is a UDOT project. This is the Devil's Slide Bridge. This is for a structural replacement and rehabilitation there on 5800 East over the Weber River and Croydon area. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with this area, but this blue rectangle here, well, that's the Devil's Slide. And if you've never had an opportunity to see it, there it is. Quite a marvel. But anyway, this structure carries 58 East over the Weber River near Croydon at Devil's Slide. The structure is 80 years old or more and in very poor condition. And frequently the water surfaces, the elevation is above the bridge deck. So you go under the railroad bridge here, and there you are on the bridge itself. The bridge structure, the curbs, the parapets, they all have extensive deterioration. This project was originally scheduled to bid back in 2020, but there were some coordination issues with the railroad and with the cement company that's just there to the north. And the project was delayed until this fall, or this past fall in 2021. And then the bids came in high due to the tight work constraints, winter work window, the inflation, and the remote location. And so the project team regrouped, and they updated the bid items and identified the reduced risk items. And once approved, this project will bid again with the additional funds. So there's an additional 2.5 million being requested for a total project cost of a little more than 6.6 plus million. The last project on this table is on I-15 in Davis County in Salt Lake County. This is a UDOT project. It's I-15 environmental impact statement. Currently, UDOT is conducting a holistic, transparent, and technically sound environmental impact statement. This study is to identify and understand and evaluate the mobility issues along the corridor, such as the aging infrastructure, interchange functionality, capacity needs, safety concerns, additional multimodal options, and the east-west connectivity. In order to accommodate early right-of-way acquisition, utility investigation, and environmental activities, the project team proposes to move $10 million from the construction pin of this same project into the environmental pin. So from the construction up to the environmental pin. So we'll take 10 million off the one and move it up to the other. And so this gives us a total amount of $20 million in the EIS portion.
Hey, Ben?
Yes.
We were notified the other day that I believe this amount is actually 6 million and not 10 million. And so if we could, we'll verify that, but it's still a pretty small percentage of the overall total project cost, but we'll verify that and make sure the correct value, whether it's 6 or 10, is in the minutes. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Wayne. That brings us to the last table here in this
Ben,
project. Yes.
Ben, excuse me, could you please go back to the I-15 project? Ben talked about the EIS work and how comprehensive it is on the I-15 project. And I just wanted to emphasize that. I mean, those of you that are in Davis County elected officials, you have participated, or at least you've been invited to participate in some pretty remarkable workshops that UDOT has been coordinating that are really focusing on the relationship between the roadway and your communities. Ben mentioned this, the east-west travel across the corridor, across the highway, as well as the relationship between the interchanges and the local and your local communities. And I just think they deserve some commendation and recognition for that, that really broad look that they're taking. I know Terry is on with us, and I mean, I'll put her on the spot a little bit and ask Terry if you want to comment about that sort of philosophy of sort of working holistically with the communities and thinking about the roadway and its relationship to the rest of the transportation system.
And I'll say that a statement we're trying to use more commonly is thinking about all users. And while we know we've got some concerns with the freeway and congestion issues, we also want to make sure as we do every project, we're thinking about all the users of the system, how people interact, no matter what mode they're taking. And so I think we're trying to step up our game a little bit and make sure we understand how people are using transit, how they're using bikes and acting as PEDs on these facilities. So I think we're trying to take a step forward there. So I appreciate you calling that out, Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just think thank you, Terry. It's so important because as you can see, everybody knows this is the biggest project in the state right now on infrastructure. Ben, I think you had the numbers there at $1.7 billion. And I just think it's again commendable that UDOT is working so carefully with all of the stakeholders to make sure that it's done right. UDOT doesn't just have blinders on and says we're only looking at the road itself, as Terry said. I just think it's the right way to do this kind of work. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everybody. Terry and Wayne. We'll verify that amount, make sure that minutes reflect that. Thank you. Well, then that brings us to the last table. And this is a project up in Ogden Canyon. This is for a barrier upgrade in certain sections of Ogden Canyon. In some areas through the canyon, the barrier is installed so near the top of the riverbank that when it's hit by a vehicle, especially the large trucks pulling trailers, semi-trucks pulling trailers, the sections of barriers often end up in the Ogden River. So the purpose of this project, the scope would be to replace the failing barrier with a similar cast-in-place barrier that was used down around the bridge projects through the sections of the canyon. So the new project is $750,000, and the estimated total cost would be $750,000. That would include the projects that are part of this board modification.
Well,
Any
thanks, Ben. Any questions for Ben on these projects? Well, before we give him the floor back to talk about our next item, if we could have a motion then to approve these modifications to the 2027 tip.
Mr. Chair, I'll make that motion.
I'll second that, Mr. Chair.
Got a motion from Beth and a second from Jim. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? Very good. Well, Ben, we will go ahead and turn that back over to you for the obligation to the federal highway and transit funds.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So the current transportation bill, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA bill, like its predecessors, requires that each MPO and the state and the public transportation operators cooperate in preparing a list of projects for which federal transportation funds were obligated for spending during the immediate preceding year. WFRC staff, with the help of UDOT and UTA, have prepared the obligation report, which includes a list of the projects that have received federal transportation funding or had obligation of federal transportation funding during the fiscal year of 2021, which began on October 1st, 2020 and concluded on September 30th, 2021. So maybe, excuse me, to initiate this discussion, let me review the definition of obligation. The Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, defines obligation as the federal government's legal commitment to reimburse the states or other entities for the federal share of a project's eligible cost. Thus, an obligated project is one that has been approved by the federal government for reimbursement. Obligated projects in this report were not necessarily initiated or completed during this past fiscal year. And obligated amounts reflected in this report also may not equal to the final project cost. So, noteworthy fact includes a lot of good work is being accomplished and many benefits are occurring throughout the state. I'd also like to point out before I get into it on the graphs that we've consolidated all the improvement types in the 9 improvement categories for clarity, legible graphs. Otherwise, this is what the graph would look like that we'd be looking at. And so by categorizing or bringing them into just 9 categories, we have a little more readable graph and it's able to understand. So this first graph shows the obligation of federal funds statewide. Federal funds require a non-federal or a local match. So we show a total of 451 million plus, which is equal to 420.7 million of federal funds plus 30.4 million plus in local matching funds. And as noted, each of these or each of the projects, they've been categorized into 9 improvement types. So these federal funds currently represent about 20% of the total highway and transit revenues for the state. I'd also like to point out that just because we only see, for example, over here on the far right, we only see bike and pedestrian totals at about 8.1 million plus, which is actually really good. Last year it was 3.6 million. But of bike and ped type projects, this does not represent all the bike and ped improvements. In fact, most of the bike and ped improvements are included in other project improvement types, like reconstruction or capacity or intersection safety, and on even some of our pavement preservation classes. Also, a couple of points to point out that this graphical display does not illustrate the mathematics of each of the categories. Let me illustrate real quick. For example, if we take the first column here, this is a pavement preservation improvements. There were over 143 projects involved. 76 projects that had obligations totaling more than $184+ million, and 67 projects that had a de-obligation of $17.3+ million. So if you add them together, that gives us the 143 projects with an obligation or a de-obligation of 167 million plus. So that's how to read or understand these tables. So if we were to move on to just the WFRC
Ben.
area.
Ben,
Yes.
excuse me, I'm going to interrupt just for one last time. Can you go back one slide, please? I want to note two things. One, Ben was just talking about the obligations and de-obligations and the funds moving around. I just want to emphasize that takes so much work and coordination to make sure it's all done smoothly. And Ben and Wayne and our team working with UDOT and working with the cities and the counties, all of you, it's a really well-oiled machine that works here. We should all be proud of the collaborative effort to move the projects forward and be really flexible, particularly because federal funds carry with them additional requirements that can increase costs. And so navigating the use of the funds and moving them around and being flexible, that is something that is overseen by this committee, by Transcom, but our teams, our staff do a really remarkable job in navigating that to keep projects moving. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second point, Ben, I'm just going to emphasize something that you're noting about the role of federal funds in our overall transportation system in Utah. You see on the screen in front of you in 1 year, 451 million in federal and matching funds. That's a lot of money. But in the aggregate, that actually represents a relatively small percentage, well below a majority of the total funding that gets spent on transportation in Utah in a given year, when you take UDOT, the local governments, UTA, et cetera. In fact, Utah is one of the states that has the lowest percentage of our total transportation spending from federal funds of any states in the nation. And that enables us to focus federal funds on what you're seeing here on the screen, mainly preservation and reconstruction, less on putting new projects, new capacity projects. Because we use state funds and other local funds to do those new capacity projects, they are less federal strings attached. And we navigate the use of federal funds more towards preservation, maintenance, and operations. It's a way that we balance out our system, and it's effective, but the federal funds provide a really core base to do just the most basic maintenance of the system and improvement to the system. Yeah, and then we use typically other funds to do the capacity improvements. And I wanted to interject that now, Ben, and I apologize for interrupting you because Miranda and I have to drop off because we're going to head back to the Capitol and keep advocating for all of you and your needs. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, thank you for pointing out with the staff of UDOT, each of your cities and UTA, it's a real pleasure, and we work with great people. So in our next graph, this shows the estimated obligation of federal funds within WFRC region. And I say estimated here because some of the projects or programs, they cross multiple areas, and each of those projects have been categorized into one of the 9 improvement types. So here we see 266+ million of the 451 million that was statewide obligated or de-obligated in the WFRC area, which equates to about 60% of the federal transportation funds in the federal fiscal year of 2021. Behind this table, now this information is included in your meeting materials. Behind this table, there's a series of about 14 pages that list the projects that show the obligation, de-obligation in the WFRC area. If you want it for the whole state, we can provide that as well. But the 14 pages show that in the WFRC area, and that's what that green graph would refer to. The next graph that we look at is the specific programs the WFRC takes the lead in the programming and the coordinating of. We have the Surface Transportation Program funds for the Salt Lake West Valley urban area. There you can see that there was a Obligation amount of 29 plus million. The Surface Transportation Program, or STP, in the Ogden Layton area of a little more than 11 million. The CMAQ funds for the WFRC total area was a little more than 6 million. And in the TAP funds, a little more than 1.4 plus million. And that gives us a total federal obligation of almost $48 million this past year. A lot of money, a lot of work that each of your entities is involved with. Behind that graph is a table. There's actually 5 tables, and that identifies each of the projects that had obligations and de-obligations within those programs that WFRC administers. Then finally here at the end, we've got the opportunity to review the obligation, de-obligations through UTA. Now, one thing to note is this does not reflect all the other local and federal fund sources utilized by UTA. And if you'll recall, like Andrew pointed out, that we have other federal funds currently represent, or the federal funds currently represent in this report, about 20% of the total highway and transit revenues. So a significant amount of work, a lot of projects, and our community has been very blessed. Attached to the tail end of this graph is the table that identifies those grants that will illustrate, or that are illustrated by the graph of the UTA funds obligated. So that's all the material that's part of the information, the obligation report that's included in your meeting materials. Are there any questions?
Oh, come on. Someone's got to have a question for Ben. All right. Well, then that brings us. Thanks, Ben. You have been amazing. I came down to your office for ice cream, and I'm just a little disappointed. I mean, I'm here by
Next
myself.
meeting.
Yeah, next meeting. Okay. Good deal. That means we've got to be live next meeting. Got to be in person. So thank you, Ben. That's going to bring us to just our other business. So just a couple of notes. We have a new committee member orientation. So that's for everybody, whether you're new or not. You're welcome to come attend. It's February 24th at 1:30 to 3 o'clock. It'll be virtual. And then our next meeting is April 14th. We'll be on we're the second Wednesday for the April meeting instead of the normal third Wednesday. So just note the date change. And now the most fun and enjoyable part of our entire meeting today. We have the opportunity, should you need to attend, to participate in the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act, which we have to do on an annual basis. This is an 8-minute training video. You are welcome to leave if you've already had the training. You're welcome to stick around if you haven't and count it as your training. We will adjourn when that is done. And so unless anybody has anything else to bring up, I would entertain then a motion to adjourn this meeting once that video training is complete.
So move.
I heard, Andrea, did you catch who that was?
I'll make that motion. This is Howard.
Okay, we got Howard, Mayor Madsen. And who was our second? Was that Jim?
Jim Harvey, second.
All right. Any further discussion? Then we stand adjourned after the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.
Grab the popcorn.
So what's the Open and Public Meetings Act? It's the state law that ensures government actions and deliberations are openly conducted. Before we continue, keep in mind that this video is an overview, and exceptions may exist based on your entity type. So what's considered an open and public meeting? It's when a governing body majority meets to discuss or act upon government business. It includes the meetings sometimes referred to as workshops or executive sessions. Regular meetings, public hearings, electronic meetings, and emergency meetings are all open and public meetings. Open and public meetings don't include chance or social meetings. A public hearing is a type of open and public meeting where citizens have a reasonable opportunity to speak. Public hearings happen when a government adopts a budget or imposes or increases taxes or fees. An electronic meeting is a type of open and public meeting that's convened electronically, such as via phone or the internet. Remember, the governing body must adopt a resolution, rule, or ordinance allowing and governing electronic meetings. An open and public meeting may be closed to discuss any of the following: a person's character, competence, or health, security personnel, devices, or systems deployment, collective bargaining, litigation, purchase, sale, or lease of property if an open discussion would prevent the entity from completing the transaction on the best terms, investigations of criminal misconduct, and private or protected information per the Utah Procurement Code, including trade secrets. 2/3 of the governing body need to vote yes to close a meeting. Quick math lesson. 2 divided by 3 equals 66.7%. Let's say your governing body has 5 members. If 3 out of the 5 members vote yes, that equals 60%, which is not equal to or greater than 66.7%, which means you're 1 member short and instead need 4 out of 5 members to vote yes. During a closed meeting, a governing body can't interview someone applying to fill an elected position, discuss filling a midterm vacancy or temporary absence, discuss the character, competence, or health of a person whose name was submitted for consideration to fill a midterm vacancy or temporary absence, or approve any ordinance, resolution, rule, regulation, contract, or appointment. If a closed meeting is discussing a person's character, competence, or health, or security personnel, devices, or systems deployment, no recording or minutes are required. However, the presiding member needs to sign a sworn written statement stating such. If the closed meeting is held for any other reason, a recording must be made. Emergency meetings may be held to discuss an urgent matter due to unforeseen circumstances. In order to hold the meeting, the best notice that's feasible is provided of the time, location, and topics to be considered. An attempt is made to contact all governing body members, and a governing body majority approves the meeting. Entities that hold regular meetings need to provide notice at least annually of the year's meeting schedule. As always, the notice must include date, time, and place. For entities that don't hold regularly scheduled regular meetings, 24 hours notice must be provided. All meetings, whether regularly scheduled in advance over the course of the year or scheduled as needed, must provide no less than 24 hours notice of meeting agendas. If a public hearing is held, public notice requirements change. Make sure to distinguish between regular meeting notice requirements and public hearing notice requirements. For regular meetings, an entity is only required to notify a newspaper and doesn't need to pay to publish a notice. For public hearings, notice must be published in at least one issue of a newspaper. If a newspaper of general circulation isn't available, written notice is posted in 3 public places within the entity's boundaries. Regular meetings require 24 hours notice. Public hearings require 7 days notice. For both regular meetings and public hearings, written notice must be posted at the principal office of the governing body, or, if no such office exists, at the building where the meeting will be held. Governing bodies must also provide notice of open and public meetings on the Public Notice website at publicnotice.utah.gov. By posting on the website and providing the email of the local newspaper, governing bodies can also meet the requirement to notify a newspaper. However, other requirements such as publishing in a newspaper still apply. Typically, posting on the Public Notice website is done by the records officer, recorder, or clerk. However, it's the governing body's responsibility to ensure notice is provided. State Archives has prepared a training manual and quick guide for owners and posters, as well as training videos that can be accessed at their website at archives.utah.gov. If your entity is increasing a fee or undergoing truth and taxation for a property tax increase, be aware that there are additional notice and posting requirements. Public meeting agendas need to include reasonably specified topics to be considered, with each topic listed under a separate agenda item on the meeting agenda. The governing body may not consider a topic in an open meeting that wasn't on the agenda. If a new topic not on the agenda is raised by the public during an open meeting, the governing body may discuss the topic. However, final action may not be taken on the new topic during that meeting. Meeting minutes and an audio recording are required for all open meetings, with limited exceptions. When an open or closed meeting is required to be recorded, it must be unedited and contain all the portions of the meeting. Recordings of open meetings must be made available within 3 days. Every entity needs to establish procedures for the governing body's approval of minutes. Pending minutes are written minutes prepared in draft form and are subject to change before being approved by the governing body. Pending minutes must contain a clear indication, such as a draft or pending watermark, that the governing body hasn't yet approved the minutes and that they're subject to change. Pending minutes must be made available within 30 days. Approved minutes are written minutes of a meeting that have been approved by the governing body. Approved minutes are the official record of the meeting and must be made available within 3 business days. Whoever is responsible for taking the minutes during meetings, typically the records officer, recorder, or clerk, needs to be familiar with what OPMA requires be contained in the minutes. When a governing body closes a meeting, the following must be publicly announced and entered into the minutes of the open meeting at which the closed meeting was approved. The reason or reasons for holding the closed meeting, the location where the closed meeting will be held, and the vote of each member of the governing body either for or against the motion to close the meeting. The recording and any minutes must include the date, time, and location of the meeting, the names of the governing body members present and absent, and the names of all others present except where disclosure would infringe on the confidentiality necessary to fulfill the original purpose of closing the meeting. For more information, access our local government resource center at resources.auditor.utah.gov.
And now you can all go home. Thanks, everyone.
Yay.
Thank you.